The road goes in Monday morning, Mr. Hale, with or without your cooperation, because that strip of grass has been functionally part of our common area for years. That was Diane Pruitt, president of the Cedar Hollow Homeowners Association for 9 years running, standing at the foot of my driveway on a Tuesday in April, reading from a clipboard she held like a subpoena. The strip of grass she meant was the front 40 feet of my yard, the part that runs from my porch steps down to the county road. And she had just informed me that her board had voted to pave a connector road straight through it to link the new section of the subdivision to the highway. I was 63 years old. I had owned that land for 31 years. And what Diane Pruitt did not know, what she never once thought to check in the 4 years she spent treating my property like an item on her agenda, was that the title to those 40 feet had never belonged to the subdivision at all. It belonged to me, recorded and surveyed. And I had spent my whole working life as a county land surveyor, learning exactly what that meant. So let me ask you something before I tell you the rest. If a woman in a pink blazer stood on your land and told you the bulldozers were already scheduled, that the vote was already taken, that your deed was a formality her lawyers would sort out later, what would you have done? Would you have shouted? Would you have called your own lawyer that afternoon and started burning money? I did none of those things. I went inside and I opened a drawer and I started a folder. Because paper outlasts people who are sure of themselves. And I had a lot of paper. My name is Walter Hale. For 38 years I worked for the county survey office, the last 14 of them as chief of the boundary division, which is a long way of saying I spent my life walking property lines with a transit and a steel chain and settling arguments between neighbors who each swore the fence was in the wrong place. I retired the spring my wife Ruth passed because the house felt too quiet to come home to. And the work had started to feel like other people's troubles. We bought our place in 1994. Back when Cedar Hollow was just 12 houses on a gravel loop at the edge of the foothills, before the developers came and turned the back pasture into cul-de-sacs with names like Aspen Glen and Summit View. Our lot sat at the mouth of the loop, the first house you passed coming in 2.5 acres, with a long sloping front yard that Ruth had planted with lilacs the first autumn we lived there. Those lilacs were 29 years old now. They were exactly what Diane Pruitt's road was scheduled to run through. Ruth and I raised one daughter in that house, and after Ruth was gone, my granddaughter Casey came to live with me. Casey was 16 that April, a quiet kid with her grandmother's stubbornness, and she had been with me 2 years by then, ever since her mother took a job overseas and decided a mountain town with good schools beat, dragging a teenager across an ocean. Casey kept the lilacs trimmed because they had been Ruth's. She did it without being asked, the second week of every May, with Ruth's old wooden-handled shears that lived on a nail in the mudroom, and she swept the clippings into a feed sack the way Ruth used to. I would watch her from the kitchen window and feel my chest go tight because she stood the same way her grandmother had, weight on one hip, head tilted at the branch she was about to cut. She is the reason this story has a happy ending, and she is the one who first told me to write everything down, though she will tell you she only said it because I was pacing the kitchen muttering, and she wanted me to sit. She put a legal pad in front of me and a pen on top of it and said, "Grandpa, you taught me to keep receipts, so keep receipts." I sat. I have done what that girl told me ever since. The house itself was Ruth's monument as much as the lilacs. We had bought it half-finished, a shell with good bones on a slope nobody else wanted, and we spent a decade making it right. Ruth picked the colors. I built the porch I was standing on the morning the excavator came, every board of it, and I knew the survey of that lot the way you know the lines on your own hand, because I had run it myself before we ever signed, walking the bounds with my chain on a Saturday, while Ruth held the far end and laughed at me for working on my day off. The front 40 feet, the sloping piece down to the road, was the part she loved most because it caught the evening light and the lilacs glowed in it. That was the piece Diane Pruitt's road was scheduled to run through. I want you to understand that before we go further. This was never a strip of grass to me. It was the last thing my wife planted. I want you to understand who Diane Pruitt was because she was not a cartoon, however much she behaved like one. She and her husband Greg had moved into the big house on Summit View 6 years back, and within 18 months, she had run for the HOA board and won, and within another year she was president. Greg Pruitt ran a development company. That detail mattered more than I understood at the time, and I will come back to it. Because the road through my yard was never really about a road. In those first months, though, I only knew her as the woman who drove a white luxury SUV with a vanity plate down our quiet loop, slowing in front of my house every few days to look at my lilacs the way a tax assessor looks at an addition you forgot to permit. The first contact was a letter. It came in March of the year before. Everything broke open. A single sheet on Cedar Hollow letterhead informing me that my landscaping encroachment along the front of my property was out of compliance with community aesthetic standards. I read it twice at the kitchen table with my coffee going cold. The word that stuck was encroachment. Because an encroachment is a thing that crosses a line, and I had spent 38 years establishing where lines actually were. And I knew to the inch where this one ran. Then I drove to the county office, where I had worked for almost 4 decades. Parked in the lot where my old space still had the faded paint of my initials on the curb, and pulled my own plat from the drawer I used to keep it in. I confirmed what I already knew in my bones. The HOA's recorded boundary did not include my front yard. It did not include my lilacs. The subdivision's common area ended at a survey pin I had personally verified years before, a half-inch rebar capped in yellow plastic that I could have walked you to blindfolded. And that pin sat 14 feet inside the county road right-of-way, nowhere near my hedge. I made a copy of the plat. I dated it in the corner the way I always taught my crews to. I wrote a 1-paragraph note describing the letter and my response, and I put all 3 pages in a manila folder. On the tab, I wrote one word: Cedar Hollow. That folder is the hero of this story, and at the time it held 3 sheets of paper. I wrote Diane a polite letter back. I told her the front of my property was deeded to me, that the boundary she was citing was incorrect, and that I would be glad to walk the line with her and a surveyor of her choosing any day she liked. I never heard back. What I got instead, 6 weeks later, was the first fine. It came as a notice taped to my gate, $50 for continued aesthetic noncompliance, with a line at the bottom warning that fines would compound weekly until the violation was cured. I photographed the notice where it hung, the tape, and the gate, and the morning behind it so the date would never be in question. I took it down, dated it, and filed it. $50. I did not pay it, because you cannot owe a fine to a board that has no jurisdiction over the thing it is fining you for. But I knew enough to know that not paying would be treated as defiance, and defiance was what Diane wanted, because defiance let her escalate. So, I documented instead every notice, the day it arrived, every letter, opened and copied, and the envelope kept with the postmark. Every slow pass of the white SUV with the vanity plate, which I started logging on the legal pad with the date and the time, because a pattern of surveillance is a thing a deputy can use and a single sighting is not. By the end of that first summer, the folder held 19 pages, and the fines on paper had reached $480, none of it owed. All of it filed. Casey took to calling it the brag book because every page in it Was Diane bragging in writing about a thing she had no right to do? It was Casey who built the second layer of the record. She came home from school one afternoon and found a man in a polo shirt standing in our front yard with a clipboard and a measuring wheel, walking the property line and writing numbers down. She did not know who he was. He had a tape on his belt and a pair of mirrored sunglasses pushed up on his head, and he was rolling the wheel along the front of the lilacs like he owned the ground under them. She did the smartest thing a 16-year-old has ever done in a driveway. She took out her phone and recorded him, narrating quietly the date, the time, and what he was doing, holding the phone low against her hip the way I had never taught her but wished I had. Then she went inside and locked the door and called me at the hardware store where I was buying hinges, and her voice was steady but fast. "There's a man, Grandpa, in the yard. He's measuring." I told her to stay inside, stay on the camera, and not to open the door for anybody. I left the hinges on the counter. By the time I got home, he was gone. Just 2 flattened tracks in the dew where the wheel had run. We had 90 seconds of video of a man I did not recognize measuring my yard without permission. And that night, I sat with Casey at the table, and we watched it back twice. And I saved it to a thumb drive and a second thumb drive, and put one in the folder and one in the gun safe, which held no guns, only paper. I taught Casey the rule that night, the rule Ruth had taught me, the rule my whole career had been built on. You do not argue with people who are wrong. You record them being wrong, and you let the record argue for you. Casey nodded like she had always known it. Maybe she had. She had her grandmother's face when she was thinking. The man with the measuring wheel turned out to be the first formal escalation, and it set the pattern for everything that followed. 2 days later, a new letter arrived, this one citing a site survey that had confirmed the connector road's path across the common easement at the front of my lot. There was no easement. I had searched the title myself, line by line, in the same office where I had spent my career. The letter spoke with the flat confidence of a thing already decided, and attached to it was a notice of a special assessment, $600. My share of the engineering costs for a road I had not approved across land I owned. I added it to the folder. The running total of money the HOA claimed I owed had crossed $1,000, and I had collected, paid, or conceded exactly. I want you to hold those 2 numbers next to each other, because by the end, they will be very far apart. That fall, a deputy came to my door. His name was Sam Ruiz, and he was apologetic before he was anything else, because he had grown up 2 valleys over and knew my reputation from the survey office. He stood on my porch with his hat in his hand and would not quite meet my eye at first. He told me the HOA had filed a formal complaint, alleging I was obstructing a lawful improvement, and that a complaint, once filed, had to be looked into, whether it had merit or not. I told him I understood. I had spent my career on the other end of exactly this, the constrained officer with a complaint he did not believe but could not ignore. I poured him a cup of coffee, and we sat on the porch steps, and I asked him what it would take. He turned the cup in his hands. He said plainly that if I thought I was in the right, the thing to do was build a record. Document every interaction. Keep my responses calm and in writing. Let the pattern speak when the time came. He said a single incident was a he said, she said, but a documented pattern was a case, and a case was something he could take to people who outranked him without it falling apart in his hands. Then he looked at my lilacs, purple and heavy in the afternoon light. and he looked at the white SUV idling at the end of the loop where Diane had slowed to watch a patrol truck sit in my driveway. And he said one more thing before he left. He said, "Watch how far she's willing to go, Mr. Hale, because people like that always go one step too far. And that step is usually the one that finishes them." He set the empty cup on the rail. He said, "Just make sure when she does, you've got it on paper." I wrote down what he said that night, word for word, the way I remembered it. I filed it. It would turn out he was exactly right, down to the morning. The winter was quiet, which I've learned to distrust. The fines kept arriving and kept getting filed. Snow sat on the lilac branches and the white SUV came less often, and I almost let myself believe she had thought better of it. Then, in the spring, Diane found a new front. She started on my neighbors. There was an older couple, 2 houses down the Bensons, who had hired me years back to settle a fence dispute and who waved every time I drove past. Diane began telling them, and anyone else who would listen at the mailbox cluster, that my refusal to cooperate with the connector was the reason their property values were stalling, that the new section could not be finished and sold until the road went through, and that I was holding the whole community hostage over a row of weeds. I know. She said it because Ed Benson told me she said it, standing in my kitchen on a Saturday morning with his hat in his hands, embarrassed on her behalf. She came right to the box while I was getting my mail, Ed said, and she said it loud enough for the Coopers to hear. Said you were a bitter old man, punishing the neighborhood because you couldn't let go of a hedge. Said the Hale lot was functionally part of the common plan whether you liked it or not, and that her board would see the road through one way or another. Ed turned his hat in his hands. I didn't believe her, Walt, he said. I've known you 15 years. Plenty did, though. People hear a number about their house, and they stop thinking straight. That was the day I understood that the fight was no longer about my yard. It was about whatever was on the other side of that connector road, and why finishing it mattered enough to a development company that its owner's wife would spend 2 years and $1,000 in fake fines trying to pave my lilacs. I thanked Ed. I wrote down what he told me, the date, and the words, as near as he could give them, and I filed it with the rest. 3 voiced claims now, in 3 different places, that my land was functionally hers. I was beginning to see the shape of the thing, so I did what I should have done sooner. I pulled the records on the new section. Everything the developer files is public if you know where to look, and I had spent 38 years knowing where to look. I spent a full day at the recorder's office in the planning desk, pulling filings and copying them at a dime a page. And the picture came together slow, and then all at once. The new section of Cedar Hollow, the part beyond the back pasture, was owned by a limited liability company. The registered agent for that company was Greg Pruitt. 41 lots, surveyed and platted, sitting finished and empty because they had no legal access to the highway. I sat in that office with the plats spread out, and I traced every possible route a road could take off that back parcel. The way I had traced 1,000 routes for 1,000 clients. The grade was too steep to the north. The drainage to the east would have demanded a $500,000 culvert and a permit that would take years. The only route that worked, the only one the land itself allowed, ran through the front 40 feet of my yard. Diane's road was not a community improvement. It was the difference between 41 lots worth nothing and 41 lots worth a great deal of money, and the title to the one piece of ground that unlocked all of it was sitting in a manila folder in my gun safe with her fake fines stacked on top of it. I made copies of all of it. I drove home in the dark with the folder on the seat beside me, and I did not feel triumphant. I felt the cold quiet again, because I finally understood that she would not stop, that a woman fronting that much money for her husband does not back down over a deed, and that she would have to be allowed to reach all the way to the end of her rope herself. I did not call her. I did not call Greg. I filed it. By then, the folder had outgrown itself and become a binder, a real one, 3 inches thick, tabbed by date, every notice and letter and photograph, and the 2 thumb drives in a labeled sleeve inside the front cover. I added the LLC records and the plat of the new section, and I drew a single line on the plat in red ink, the line of the only road that could ever connect those lots to the highway, and I let it run through my yard exactly where Diane said it would. Then I closed the binder. Casey asked me what I was going to do. I told her the truth. I told her I was going to wait because Diane had committed herself to a position that the ground itself would not support, and people who commit to a position the ground will not support eventually fall through it. I just had to be standing somewhere safe when she did. She crossed the line on a Thursday in May, a little after 7 in the morning. I know the day and the time because I have it on video, and because Casey was getting ready for school when we heard the diesel engine come down the loop. It was a sound that did not belong on our street. A low, heavy idle that rattled the coffee cups in the cupboard, and I knew before I reached the window what it was. I went out onto the porch in my robe and saw a low bed trailer parked across the mouth of my driveway, and an excavator being chained down off the back of it, the kind with a toothed bucket that takes out a hedge. Diane Pruitt stood in my front yard in a magenta blazer and white sneakers, the sneakers already dark with dew, directing 2 men in hard hats toward my lilacs. She had a folded document in her hand. She was pointing at the hedge with it the way she had pointed at everything for 2 years, like the pointing made it so. "Mr. Hale?" she called up to the porch, bright as a Sunday. "The board authorized the grading to begin this morning. You've had every opportunity to cooperate. I'd suggest you and the girl stay inside, because this is heavy equipment, and we wouldn't want anyone hurt." The girl. Casey was standing in the doorway behind me, in her school clothes, with her phone already up and recording, because I had taught her. And the first thing that went through me when Diane said the girl was not fear and was not anger, it was a kind of cold quiet. The same quiet I used to feel when a boundary I had walked 100 times finally lined up in the glass, and the answer was undeniable. I told Casey, low, to stay on the porch and keep recording. Get the plate of the trailer, get the faces of the men, get the paper in Diane's hand. She moved to the rail without a word and braced her elbows on it to hold the phone steady, and I was never prouder of her than in that quiet minute. Then I walked down my own front steps in my robe and my slippers across the wet grass, and I did not raise my voice, and I asked Diane Pruitt one question. I asked her to show me the easement. She blinked. For just a second the brightness slipped, and then it came back. "It's all in the authorization," she said, and held up the folded paper, and I did not reach for it. She did not have an easement. She had a grading authorization signed by her own board, which is to say a permission slip the HOA had written to itself to do something on land the HOA did not own. I told her level and plain that the men needed to get off my property and the equipment needed to go back on the trailer, and that she was welcome to bring me a recorded easement any day she found one. She laughed. She actually laughed, standing in Ruth's lilacs, and she told the men to start the machine. "We are well past asking permission," she said. One of them, the older one with gray in his beard, looked at the excavator and looked at me on my own front steps in my robe and did not move. The younger one looked at Diane, looked at the older man, and climbed up into the cab anyway. That was the moment I called Sam Ruiz. Not 911. I called the deputy directly, the way you call a man you have decided to trust, and I told him there was an excavator about to dig up my deeded front yard on the strength of an HOA board memo, that there were 2 contractors and the HOA president on my property, that I had it all on video, and that I would meet him at the county recorder's office in 40 minutes with the title if he would meet me there too. He told me to keep everyone calm and keep recording, and not to put my hands on anyone or anything. Then he came. He did not come with sirens. He came quiet, the patrol truck rolling up the loop and stopping behind the trailer, and he got out and put his hat on and asked everyone to step back from the equipment. The younger contractor shut the machine down, and the sudden silence after that diesel was its own kind of loud. Diane started talking fast, the way people do when a uniform arrives, and they assume it has come for their side, telling Sam about the board vote and the assessment and my years of obstruction, her words tumbling over each other. Sam let her talk, because letting people talk is most of the job, and because the more she said, the more there was on his recorder. When she finished, he asked her the same question I had asked her. He asked to see the recorded easement that gave the association the right to grade across my front yard. She held up the grading authorization. He took it, read it front and back, and handed it back to her. He told her, plain as I had, that a board cannot authorize work on land it does not hold title to, and that what he needed to see was a recorded instrument from the county, and that until somebody produced one, the equipment was going back on the trailer and everyone without a deed to this lot was going to leave. The older contractor was already loosening the chains. He looked at me as he passed and gave me a small nod, one working man to another, and I understood he had not wanted any part of this from the moment he pulled up. Sam looked at me. Then he said, "You told me you had the title." I said I did. He said, "Then I think we should all go look at it." What happened next happened at the county recorder's office, at the long oak counter where I had filed 1,000 plats in my life. And it is the part I have told most carefully, because it is the whole point. I did not bring the binder to be dramatic. I brought it because it was the truth, organized. Diane came because Sam suggested, in the level way that is not a suggestion, that she might want to be present when the title was pulled. Greg came because Diane called him from the parking lot, and I watched the white SUV and his work truck arrive within a minute of each other. The recorder was a woman named Paula, who had trained under me 20 years before. She knew exactly what I was handing her, and she knew exactly what it meant. And she did not let any of that show on her face, because she was good at her job, and her job was the record. I laid the deed on the counter. Just the deed, the original recorded instrument, the legal description of 2.5 acres including the front, 40 feet, recorded in 1994 with my name and Ruth's name on it, the meets and bounds running down to the county right-of-way exactly where my lilacs stood. I did not say anything while I laid it down. I had decided in the truck on the way over that I would not say one word more than I had to, because the paper would say it better than I could. Paula pulled the official county copy to match it, sliding the heavy plat book onto the counter and turning it so we could all see. And she laid the subdivision plat beside it, the one that platted Cedar Hollow's common area. She traced the common area boundary with one finger, slow, while the room went quiet. The common area ended at the survey pin. The pin sat 14 feet short of my hedge. Between the pin and my lilacs was a strip of ground that the recorded plat showed, in the county's own ink, as belonging to Lot 1, my lot, Walter and Ruth Hale, since 1994. There was a long beat where nobody said anything. I could hear the clock on the wall and the heat ticking in the ducts. Diane looked at the deed and looked at the plat and looked at her husband. Greg Pruitt had arrived a step behind her and had not said a word, and now he leaned over the counter and read the legal description himself, his finger moving along the metes and bounds the way a man checks a figure he already knows. He's going to be bad. Greg understood plats. Greg had built a career on plats. He had gone the color of putty. He was doing the arithmetic that his wife had never bothered to do in 4 years, which was that the 41 lots of the new section had no legal access without this ground. That this ground had belonged to me since the year his wife was in high school, and that everything stacked on top of that fact. Every fine and every notice and the excavator sitting out in my driveway that very morning had been built on a boundary that did not exist. He straightened up and he looked at Diane and he said, one word. Low. Just her name. And there was a whole marriage's worth of trouble in it. Diane was not ready to let go. She put her finger on the plat, and she said the common plan had always contemplated the connector, that the lot was functionally part of the development, whether the old line said so or not. It was the 4th time I had heard her say, functionally. And it was the last. Paula straightened up. Paula, she said, for the record, to the deputy, in the flat, even voice of a county officer reading what the documents showed, that the front 40 feet of the parcel was deeded to Mr. Documents, and Hale that the association's common area did not and never had extended to it, and that there was no recorded easement of any kind burdening the front of the lot. Sam wrote it down in his notebook. Then he turned to Diane Pruitt and told her that the grading authorization was void on its face, that any work performed on my property would have been criminal trespass and destruction of property, and that she should consider this a formal warning before things went further than a warning. He closed the notebook. The sound of it closing was the loudest thing in the room. Here is the pair of numbers I ask you to hold. The HOA had levied over 2 years exactly $6,400 in fines, assessments, and penalties against me. I had paid 0. The deed that ended the entire dispute had been sitting in the public record, available to anyone with the price of a copy and the patience to read it. Since 1994, 29 years before Diane Pruitt sent her first letter. She had spent 2 years and a great deal of her credibility fighting a piece of paper she could have read in an afternoon for the cost of a cup of coffee. The consequence did not come from me. I want to be clear about that, because the temptation in a story like this is to imagine I did something to her, and I did not. I closed my binder and I drove home, and I made Casey a late breakfast because she had missed first period for all of it, eggs and the good bacon, and we sat at Ruth's table and did not say much. And that was the whole of my revenge that morning. The consequence came from the same ground that had always been the truth. The 41 lots of the new section had been sold to the LLC's investors on the representation that highway access was secured. It was not secured. It had never been secured because the only route ran through my yard. And now there was a recorded finding and a sheriff's report and a video saying so. The investors found out the way investors do. When a man in their own group hired his own surveyor to walk the back parcel and came back with the same answer I had carried for years. A development company that promises access it does not control, and spends 2 years trying to manufacture that access through fraudulent fines against a private owner, is a company with a problem that grows teeth. The state took an interest in how those lots had been marketed, and how the assessments against me had been levied. Subpoenas went where my fines had come from. Greg's company did not survive the year. The connector road was never built. The 41 lots sat empty through 2 winters until a different builder bought them out of a bankruptcy auction and put in the expensive culvert, the legal access to the east that Diane had spent 2 years trying to steal from me instead. The road exists today. It runs nowhere near my lilacs. It cost its builder exactly what the land always said it would cost, which was the $500,000 Diane had been unwilling to spend when 40 feet of my yard looked cheaper. Diane resigned the HOA presidency that summer, not because anyone forced her out, but because the board that had rubber-stamped her grading authorization read the same recorder's finding I did and understood, finally, what she had nearly cost them. A homeowners association that destroys a member's deeded property on the strength of a memo it wrote to itself is an association that gets sued into the ground, and the board members had houses of their own and savings behind those houses. Ed Benson stood up at the next community meeting and read the recorder's finding aloud, every word, in the slow, careful voice of a man who had practiced it at his kitchen table. When he finished, he said that he was sorry he had ever doubted me, and that he had known me for 15 years, and known Diane for 6, and he should have trusted a man who walked his fence line for free over the woman who fined him for his mailbox. I was not there. Casey was sitting in the back with a friend, and she recorded that too, not because I asked her to, but because it was a thing worth keeping. She came home and told me about it at the kitchen table, and she played me the part where the whole room went quiet, and she was prouder than I had any right to make her. The lilacs are still there. That is the thing I come back to. They bloomed that May, while the excavator sat chained on the trailer, 29 years of Ruth's planting, purple along the front of the only piece of that hillside Diane Pruitt never got to touch. I stood out there the evening after the recorder's office, in the same light Ruth had loved, and I did not feel like a man who had won anything. I felt like a man who had kept a promise, which is a quieter thing and lasts longer. Casey trims them now in the spring the way her grandmother did, with the wooden-handled shears off the nail in the mudroom. And last year she asked me to teach her how to read a plat, how to find the pin, how to walk a line and make the ground agree with the paper. I am teaching her. We went out one Saturday with my old chain and found the yellow-capped rebar under 30 years of leaf litter, 14 feet inside the right-of-way, exactly where I had told her it would be, and she knelt down and put her hand on it like it was something holy. She is better at it than I was at her age, and she has the one thing I had to learn the hard way, which is patience, the understanding that you do not have to win the argument today. If your name is on the deed, and the deed is recorded, and you kept every piece of paper they ever sent you. So here is the lesson, the practical one, because I promised it to you at the start, and a promise is a thing you keep. If someone with a clipboard tells you that your land is functionally theirs, do not argue with them. Go to the county recorder's office and pull your deed and pull the plat and read the legal description against the ground, the actual ground, the fence and the pin and the right-of-way. Verify where your boundary truly runs before anyone tells you where it runs. Then start a folder. Date everything. Photograph every notice the day it arrives. Save every recording to 2 drives. Keep your answers calm and in writing, because an angry phone call vanishes and a dated letter does not. File a records request if you have to. Walk your line with a licensed surveyor if you are not sure. And install a camera at the gate, because the people who are sure they are right almost never expect to be recorded being wrong. The deed is only as strong as your willingness to prove it, and the proof is paper, kept patiently. Until the morning someone drives an excavator up to your lilacs, and you get to lay it on the counter. If you have a story like this one, a fence, a gate, a road, a boundary somebody tried to take with a memo, put it in the comments, because I read them and because somebody else fighting the same fight needs to hear that the deed wins. Subscribe if you want to hear the next one. And the next one is a good one. It is about a woman who inherited her family's lakefront cabin and the HOA that told her the shoreline had been dedicated to common use. The same week, they quietly applied for a permit to build a marina on it, not knowing that her grandfather had filed something with the federal government in 1961. I will see you then. Keep your paper close.